Good evening, welcome all to this online lecture series organized by the Department of English, Lalgore Government College. Today we have lecture number 5, that is a critical discussion on Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles. And this lecture will be provided by our respected guest for today's event, Professor Daisy Majumdar from Jhargram Raj College, Assistant Professor of English. This lecture series is specially organized for our 2nd SEM, 4th SEM and 6th SEM honor students. The Hound of the Baskervilles is part of their 6th SEM syllabus and they will be having exam very shortly. So I think that this lecture will be immensely helpful for them. I would request our YC sir, Professor Visheshwar Chakraborty, to deliver a welcome address and introduce our chief guest. Sir, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Doipan, and I would warmly welcome Daisy Majumdar, Assistant Professor English at Jhargram Raj College, for being able to make a time for us and to deliver a talk on the Hound of Baskervilles as a part of the syllabus of the 6th semester for our honor students. But the appeal of the text goes beyond the syllabus because it features one of the most loved character of the literary and cultural world, that is Sherlock Holmes, as we are familiar with from our childhood days, the great detective created by Arthur Conan Doyle. So it will be an interesting one for all the participants because of the element of the mystery, element of a little bit of horror, to some extent gothic, and the story element will keep us glued to the not only the text, also the film version of it, but and as well as any kind of discussion of the same. So I heartily welcome all to this lecture series, particularly this evening. And I am thankful to everyone for being able to make time to join in our venture and help it to be a successful one. Though it is designed for the benefit of the students who are reading in pursuing their English honors course, but the 6th semester students especially, but we have also included all semester students because this is a text which appeals to all. And we hope that the talk will be immensely beneficial, not only for their upcoming examination issues, but also to have some cues and clues which they will be using it, they will be capitalizing on it in their higher studies as well, because popular literature is becoming a very much of the canon of our mainstream syllabus, mainstream learning today. So with these few words, I thank you all, I welcome you all, and I extend my heartfelt gratitude to the speaker today, Daisy Majumdar, who, as I have told you, who is now posted at Jhargram Raj College. She holds the MPhil degree from Jadavpur University, and her interests areas are vast: Victorian literature, Thomas Hardy, and I just miss perhaps another point there was. However, uh, but these are just mainly for speaking that her interest lies in. But she is very much akin to and very much integrated with other branches of the or other genres of the English as well as Bengali as well as Indian literature. So with these few words, I formally declare this to be open, and I would request Rahul Borua, our head of the department, to say a few words before Daisy can speak. Daisy will start her lecture.
Thank you, sir. And first of all, I would like to welcome all in this lecture series. Today is the fifth day of our lecture series, and we have among us Professor Daisy Majumdar. Uh, Professor Daisy Majumdar is an assistant professor in English, WBES, and posted at present at Jhargram Raj College. She holds an MPhil in English from Jadavpur University. Her areas of interest are Victorian literature, Thomas Hardy, and American literature. I would request Professor Daisy Majumdar to start his lecture on Hound of Baskervilles. Over to Daisy, ma'am.
Thank you for the very warm welcome offered to me by Professor Vishesha Chakraborty, Professor Rahul Boru, and Professor Doipan Mitro. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to be invited to this lecture series. As a teacher of this syllabus myself, I realize full well the importance of holding such a lecture series because the syllabus is so vast. Now, as a student of English literature, I think most of us, especially those of us who are teaching today, we have grown up studying what is today known as core British literature. And in our time of study, we rarely had the opportunity to go through these branches of knowledge, if I may put it this way. You know, the Indian classical branches, Indian writings in English, the post-colonial areas, the gender, the areas which are opening up beyond, you know, gender studies limited to women's studies. You know, today we have texts like Funny Boy, which are exploring the relationship between the which are exploring how a boy who does not identify with the, you know, the cis heteronormative definition of gender, how he operates in his world. And I think we should be grateful to Vidyasagar University for opening up the branches of knowledge in our world of English studies. The topic which I have chosen today, and I repeat that I am very grateful to be invited to Government General Degree College, Lalgore. The topic is of immense interest to one and all. As Professor Vishesha Chakraborty has mentioned, it is not just a text which would be of interest to the students of English literature. For instance, when I teach the Hound of the Baskervilles in my college, there are so many professors who, you know, who tell me that, you know, Daisy, please let me know when you're taking a class. I would like to attend the class as well, because everybody's interested in detective stories. Everybody's interested in, particularly in Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes is one of the one of the pioneers of the detective as a character. It is interesting that he is placed in a paper which also features Wilkie Collins, and Wilkie Collins was a definite influence on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle when he began to write Sherlock Holmes. In fact, Sherlock Holmes is though he's not a composite character made up of various detectives who have featured before him, he definitely owes his existence to Monsieur Dupin, who was the
Hello,
character created by Edgar Allan Poe in his Murders of the Rue Morgue and the Purloined
hello,
Letter. He owes his existence to Sergeant Cuff, I think, in The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. He owes his existence to Lecoq, the, the character who was inspired by Vidocq from France in Émile Gaboriau's The Memoirs of Vidocq. So Sherlock Holmes is actually a character who was inspired by so many that came before him. But today he holds his own. He has carved out his own place in in the canon of detective fiction, if we may so call it, though canon today is a word that we are trying, especially those of us students of literature in um, the post-colonial world. So, without further ado, I think I will begin my presentation right now. I'll be turning off my camera and sharing a presentation which I have made rather hastily. So, if you spot any mistakes and any typological errors, the errors all on my part. And if you so wish, if the department so wishes, I will be more than happy to share this presentation for the sake of the students, because there are so many facts which I'm sure I'll not be able to cover in the duration of this lecture. So let me just start my presentation. So I hope this is visible to all. Please let me know if there are any lags on my end, because I'm operating from a very weak internet, unfortunately. So there may be certain lags or certain technical errors on my part. Presenting The Hound of the Baskervilles, a critical analysis. This is a picture of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, as we all know, is the author. I plan to divide this lecture into certain parts, especially into two parts, where initially I will try to contextualize The Hound of the Baskervilles as a story, as a novel, which is part of the canon of the entire legend or the entire series of the Sherlock Holmes stories and novels. You see, we have been given a text to study, is which is, of course, one of the greatest stories ever told in the canon of Sherlock Holmes, but it is also one of the later stories. It appears in 1903, 10 years after Arthur Conan Doyle literally killed off the character in the final problem. And it appears as a kind of a story, a posthumous story, a story which happened during Sherlock's lifetime, but which was published later. So by the time Arthur Conan Doyle was publishing this story, readers had a very, very good idea of what Sherlock Holmes was all about. They knew who Sherlock Holmes was, they knew about his brother Mycroft, they knew about Watson, they knew about Lestrade. So, all the names that we get in The Hound of the Baskervilles, except, of course, for the chief villain, I must issue a disclaimer that my presentation is full of spoilers. So, if there are any students who haven't yet read the text or don't know what the story is all about, I am extremely sorry. I think I will begin, or most of my
Hello.
presentation will involve the
Huh?
name of the killer, the name of the murderer, the name of the chief villain of the story. So, spoiler alert, there are plenty of spoilers. In this case, everyone knew, except for Stapleton, except for Sir Henry Baskerville, and except for the other minor characters who appear in the landscape of Dartmoor. The All the other characters are very, very well known by the readers. So I thought it would be proper of me to go back a little to examine what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is all about, and then to move into the context of the stories. Thereafter, I will be going straight into The Hound of the Baskervilles. And though the novel is extremely interesting, it's very rich in terms of the things that we can critically analyze. I have tried to keep my lecture oriented towards the syllabus that we are reading so that students can mostly benefit from it. And I have tried to feature certain key aspects of the novel, as it were, so that we have a deeper and better understanding of what we are dealing with as we read the novel as part of a syllabus. A few highlights from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's life. He was born in 1859. Interestingly, his parents were of Irish lineage. His mother, uh, and though they were of Irish lineage, his father lived in England, his mother lived in Scotland. So Arthur Conan Doyle literally had a multicultural upbringing. To us living in India, when we think of English authors, when we think of authors belonging to the UK, we have this certain fixed image in our mind that they were all English, just as Westerners, just as people abroad have this particular idea of what constitutes India. We hear these funny stories about, do you speak Indian? And so you're Indian, so you must be speaking the same language, eating the same food. At our end, we also have the same, we have similar ideas. But in the case of Arthur Conan Doyle, he was literally brought up in a multicultural background. He used to speak Scottish. He used to speak Irish, which are two completely different languages, or you can say Irish is a different language. Scottish is a kind of a different. It's a different accent. It's referred to as the Scottish burr, burr. So Arthur Conan Doyle had that Scottish burr, and yet he was a resident citizen of England, and he spoke his English very well. So Arthur Conan Doyle had this kind of a multicultural identity that was quintessentially English, and he retained his love and loyalty for his nation for the rest of his life. He went to a Catholic boarding school run by the Jesuits, and there was a lot of discipline. He didn't enjoy his school days as much as we do, probably. After graduating at the age of 17, he went off to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. At the University of Edinburgh, his formative years, it's very important to remember this phase because he met two professors, Professor William Rutherford and Dr. Joseph Bell, both of whom inspired certain literary characters. He had started writing from a very young age, and as he was taught by Dr. Joseph Bell, he noticed certain certain queer aspects about Joseph Bell. His high level of intelligence, his powers of diagnosis. He would diagnose patients by just looking at them. So Dr. Joseph Bell possessed powers of observation and deduction. He had sharp steel gray eyes, things that he used in his character of Sherlock Holmes. He once even wrote to Dr. Joseph Bell, telling him how his inspiration has delivered to Conan Doyle a most wonderful character. We will come to that later. Conan Doyle started his writing career while still enrolled in medical school. Two of his early short stories are The Mystery of Sasassa Valley, which was published in the Chambers Journal, and The American Tale, which was published in London Society. Interestingly, while he was graduating, he took up a
আচ্ছা
job
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা
as a
হ্যাঁ বলো বলো
doctor on a whaling ship called Hope. And later on, he also worked as a ship surgeon on a ship called
আচ্ছা
Mayumba,
আচ্ছা
which sailed to Africa, where he
হ্যাঁ
had
তোদের আমি সব স্টার্ট
multiple
করেছি ওয়ান ওয়ান দেখো
experiences.
তো সমস্যা হবে না
On his
নেক্সট
return
বার থেকে আমি
in
ঠিক থেকে স্টার্ট
1882,
করবো
he settled at Plymouth,
এবং
where he struck up a
সেটা ব্লেন্ডেড
friendship
নোটেই
with
ভাবছি
another doctor. They tried to set up a practice together, but there were differences, and he had to leave that
ও
practice.
আচ্ছা
He
আচ্ছা
later
আমি
moved to
আমার
South
ফ্ল্যাটটা
Sea
হচ্ছে দমদম
Portsmouth
দমদম
and set up
কাছে
his private
দমদম
practice.
তো
It is
যদিও প্রত্যেক উইকে
important.
না মোস্ট
The
প্রবাবলি
South
আমি
Sea
হয়তো
Portsmouth is important because
স্ট্রিক্সের
he
কিছু
had just
এরিয়া রয়েছে
started
যেগুলো
out
প্রায়
his
কাজ করা
practice.
কারণ সেগুলো
He
প্র্যাকটিস
was
করতে হবে
slightly
যেহেতু
bored
রেগুলার
because
সিরিজটা
practice did not
দেখো
take
আমি
off as well as
সেইগুলোর
he
জন্য
had
তো আমি
hoped.
মাঝে মধ্যে এখন
His
মাসে
evenings
হয়তো
were
দুদিন দেখা
free,
ম্যাক্সিমাম
and this is exactly when
আচ্ছা
he
তাহলে ঠিক
started
আছে আমি
writing his
সেরকমভাবে অ্যারেঞ্জ
Sherlock
করবো
Holmes
বলতে পারবো
stories.
বা পড়াগুলো
In
নেওয়ার একটা ব্যাপার থাকে টাইমের
1887,
মধ্যে দিয়ে
Sherlock Holmes made
কারণ
his
আমি
debut
একদম
in the
ধরো
Beeton's
এক্সাম দিচ্ছি
Christmas
সেটা
Annual.
সেরকম
Now, this Christmas Annual is a seasonal magazine. You know, in Bengal, we have our Puja Barshikis, which we look forward to with all eagerness just before Durga Puja. The same thing happens in Beaton's Christmas Annual. It used to be published in November, I think, or October, quite a few days before Christmas actually appeared on the scene. And a study in Scarlet was published in this annual. As difficult as it is to imagine today, a study in Scarlet had been rejected by multiple publishers before it was finally accepted in the Beaton's Christmas Annual. Other than that, he led a very adventurous life. He volunteered to serve in the Boer Wars in Africa as a doctor who would stay behind the lines. You know, he would attend to soldiers who had fallen on the battlefield. He was knighted for his services by King Edward VII, and it was rumored that he was knighted because it was rumored that he was knighted because after killing off Sherlock Holmes, he had revived him again. And King Edward was a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, so apparently he had even written to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to, you know, revive the great detective. Apart from his services to the nation, he was also a kind man um, who tried to look at people without prejudice. Two cases where he offered his own services as a as an investigator, as a free investigator. The case of George Edelji, who was interestingly a Parsi Indian, and Oscar Slater, who was accused of murdering a woman. On the personal front, he married twice. He was married to Louise Hawkins, with whom he had two children, Mary and Kingsley. And after the death of Louise, he married a lady named Jean Leckie, with whom he had three other children, Dennis,
Ma'am,
Adrian.
sorry to interrupt you. Are you
Yes,
actually changing the slides because slides are not changing? It is in
yes,
the
I have.
it is in the first slide,
Okay,
critical
oh,
analysis that we
okay.
can see.
Then
Yeah, yeah. Now it is changed. Yeah. I
now
think
it's changed.
that is a problem with Google Meet because if we go full screen, then the slides are not changing as we have seen for the last few days. Okay, so if you
Okay,
actually
so
minimize
I
it,
think I
then
will just
it
go
will.
back.
Okay, okay. Yeah, kindly continue.
Okay, if is is this right?
It is not audible, ma'am, currently.
Yes, was just where I was at. Uh, just give me a minute. Yes. I hope it's visible now.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. So I will continue. Yes, he had three children with his second wife, Dennis, Adrian, and Jean. He lost his son Kingsley from his first marriage and his brother Ince, two brothers in law, and two nephews to the First World War. So, for those of us who have read through war literature and especially stories such as The Fly or the war poems, we know how badly the war had impacted all of England. As a result of the grief resulting from the deaths in his family, Toyle had turned towards spiritualism. Spiritualism is a branch of study at that time, which was quite in vogue at the time, where they believed that the dead could be communicated with through various kinds of mediums. And there was this concept of auto writing. In fact, his own wife, Jean Leckie, had become an auto writer. There's also an interesting story about his friendship with Harry Houdini, the magician, and how it fell apart because of Jean Leckie and her auto writing. Arthur Conan Doyle died in July 1930 after an illustrious life as, and I quote, doctor, author, sportsman, patriot, journalist, amateur detective, historian, scientist, adventurer, husband, father, and religious advocate. And yet, today, we only remember him as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. His epitaph reads, Steel true, blade straight. A very, very interesting epitaph, in my opinion. Moving on to his most famous creation, I would have loved to go on about his other creations and his other writings, but time does not permit the same. I would like to focus on Sherlock Holmes, the character. As I have already mentioned, Sherlock Holmes, though not a composite mixture of the other characters, Doyle was greatly inspired by Monsieur Dupin, Sergeant Cuff, and Monsieur Lecoq. And in fact, the real life model was Dr. Joseph Bell. And I have a picture of him. I hope it is vaguely visible in this limited screen share, which we have to, compromise with. In his autobiography, Doyle wrote that I felt now that I was capable of something fresher and crisper and more workmanlike than many of the detective stories that had been written up to that time. Gaboriau had rather attracted me by the neat dovetailing of his plots, and Poe's masterful detective, Monsieur Dupin, had from boyhood been one of my heroes. But could I bring an addition of my own? I thought of my old teacher, Joe Bell, of his eagle face, of his curious ways, of his eerie trick of spotting details. If he were a detective, he would surely reduce this fascinating business to something nearer an exact science. I would try it if I could get this effect. It was surely possible in real life, so why should I not make it plausible in fiction? So Doyle, when he was starting out, he wanted to add a little something extra. After the success of Sherlock, he wrote to Dr. Joseph Bell that it is most certainly to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes, and though in the stories I have the advantage of being able to place the detective in all sorts of dramatic positions, I do not think that his analytical work is in the least an exaggeration of some effects which I have seen you produce in the outpatient ward. So Dr. Joseph Bell was literally the Sherlock of the medical university. He used to perform these very accurate diagnosis, and he was a great inspiration to Doyle. And Dr. Bell wrote back, You are yourself Sherlock Holmes, and well you know it, the highest form of praise that can be received from a teacher. So, when Conan Doyle was starting out and he had created his detective, he went through a variety of names. He wanted his detective to be very British, to be characteristically British. And initially he had settled on the name Sherrington Hope. He then changed it to Sherrington Holmes because Holmes was a very common British surname. He didn't like Sherrington, however, and then moved on to Sherrinford. He ultimately settled on the name Sherlock after being inspired by certain detectives of the Metropolitan Police Force, two of them who had the surname of Sherlock. So he was constantly reading the papers, he was reading about Inspector William Sherlock and Inspector James Sherlock. And it is assumed that he modeled his detective, or he paid them a tribute by naming his detective Sherlock. John Watson was also not known as John Watson. Initially, he was called Ormond Sacker. And Doyle assigned the following characteristics to his protagonist: reserved, sleepy eyed young man, and a philosopher. He was also a collector of rare violins. For those of us who have read some of the stories, we also know that Holmes was not this perfect model of a man. He was addicted to morphine and cocaine. He was driven to bouts of melancholy, and he had this method. He was socially anxious. In fact, modern psychological research has placed a character study of Holmes, and many studies suggest that Holmes had a degree of autism in his psychological makeup that made him so different, so uniquely different from the rest of the men. If we go into his methods of detection can be divided into two basic categories: crime scene investigation and deductive reasoning. If you have read The Hound of the Baskervilles very properly, you already know that the crime scene investigation of Sir Charles Baskerville's death was not possible by Sherlock Holmes, and he lets out this cry of regret. If only I could have been there, if only I could have read the clues which were written upon that gravel the night of the murder. He has no doubt that it was planned murder. And for him, it's almost like he has missed out on the prize because he cannot do a very careful observation of the crime scene. Most of the novel is based on his deductive reasoning after careful observation and collection of evidence. When several theories were possible, he would always opt for the one that covered the most facts in the case until he could be proven wrong. He says that it is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So, much like many other detectives, he was also a pursuer of truth. He was a pursuer of everything that could be scientifically, logically, and rationally explained. And this is the keystone on which the novel The Hound of the Baskervilles is based. Everything, including superstitions, if if read correctly, if viewed with all sorts of evidence, everything can be proved scientifically. And in his pursuit of that true cold reason which I place above all things, Holmes has more often than once been accused of being insensitive, being cold. Watson once called him an automaton, a robot, a calculating machine, adding that there's something positively inhuman in you at times. This is because emotion for Sherlock Holmes was seen as a kind of weakness. It reminds us of the general philosophies of the Enlightenment, where emotion was literally looked down upon. And Sherlock Holmes probably owes his spirit to the ghosts of the Enlightenment, where he lays all his emphasis on reason, on rationality, on logic. In A Study in Scarlet, he mentions some important methods of his. For instance, he states that one's brain should be like an attic. An attic is a place where you store things. We casually call it a loft, but in Britain at the time, especially in Victorian houses, they would have this room where they stored all the junk of the house, anything which you don't need. They would put it in the attic. The attic was a little inaccessible. So Holmes uses this metaphor of the attic, and he says that I consider that a man's brain originally is like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as You choose. He wanted to state that it is only a fool who jumbles up his brain with useless knowledge, and that the skillful workman will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work. But of these he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. This explains to us why Sherlock Holmes has a very interesting set of knowledges. Watson makes a list after his initial acquaintance with Holmes. There's an interesting episode where Watson is explaining the Copernican theory of the Earth, where the Earth revolves around the Sun, and Sherlock Holmes denies his knowledge of the same. And once Watson has explained everything, Sherlock Holmes is very clear that thank you for the knowledge, now I will do my best to forget it. Watson is extremely puzzled. Why do you want to forget it? And thereafter, Holmes explains that his brain is like an attic where he stores only those things which would be useful to him in his work. Watson makes a list of all his knowledges. He has zero knowledge of literature, philosophy, astronomy, and a very feeble knowledge of politics. His knowledge of botany is variable, well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally, knows nothing of practical gardening. His knowledge of geology is practical, but limited. He tells at a glance different soils from each other. After walks, he has shown me splashes upon his trousers, and told me by their colour and consistence in what part of London he had received them. It is well for us to note, as students of Sherlock Holmes, that he can distinguish between the various kinds of soils available in different parts of London, not different parts of England. So this is the level of his exact knowledge of whichever knowledges he chooses to store in his attic. His knowledge of chemistry is profound. His knowledge of anatomy is accurate but unsystematic, indicating that he has had no formal training in the subject. He has an immense knowledge of sensational literature. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century, which means he is well read in the papers and he has a thorough knowledge of crime and the history of crime. He plays the violin well. He is an expert single stick player, boxer, and swordsman, and has a good practical knowledge of British law. British law, as we all know, is is a collection of conventions and is a collection of things which are not bound in very significant volumes. Here we have the Sherlock Holmes canon. Uh, I will run through some very quick facts. So he made his debut in A Study in Scarlet, which I have already mentioned, was published in the Beaton's Christmas Annual. His second appearance was in The Sign of the Foe, his second novel, published in Lippincott's Monthly Magazine, which was an American publication. This shows us that Arthur Conan Doyle was still struggling to get his Sherlock stories published. As amazing as it seems now, such is the reality of writers. In 1891, Doyle revolutionized the idea of serialized fiction. We all know how Dickens and Hardy and Thackeray and all those writing in the Victorian age, they were given to bringing out episodes of their novels in monthly magazines or weekly magazines. But Doyle changed the concept where he kept his character consistent and he started writing a series of short stories where in each episode there would be a beginning and an end. So if someone missed a particular volume, there would be no problem because Sherlock Holmes and Watson remain consistent throughout the stories. The first Sherlock Holmes story appeared in 1891 in The Strand, and later on, The Strand began to be synonymous with the publication of Sherlock Holmes' stories because they made a huge profit out of subscriptions, out of people buying The Strand very frequently. In total, Doyle wrote 56 Sherlock Holmes stories, mostly for The Strand, the last one appearing in 1926. Today, for fans of Sherlock Holmes, these 56 stories and 4 novels make up what is known as the canon. However, as he continued writing the Sherlock stories, Arthur Conan Doyle began to feel a little he had a little bit of problem with Sherlock Holmes because all that the public seemed to want to read were the stories of Sherlock Holmes. No one cared about the other fictions that he was writing. No one cared about his other writings. In fact, people almost did not acknowledge him as a writer, and he felt that Sherlock, the personality of Sherlock, was obscuring his own personality as a writer. So in 1893, while on a holiday in Switzerland, he visited the Reichenbach Falls and he wrote The Final Problem, where Holmes, who meets his nemesis, Professor Moriarty, they engage in a kind of a mortal combat and they are seen to be falling off the almost 800-foot waterfall. Watson announces with a heavy heart that Sherlock Holmes is dead. However, in 1901, after a visit to Devonshire, Arthur Conan Doyle began conceptualizing the Hound of the Baskervilles based on a local legend. And initially, he conceptualized the story as a story which would not be related in any manner to Sherlock Holmes. But as the story progressed, he realized that the one character who could bring this novel together, who could perhaps best represent this novel, would be none other than Sherlock Holmes. And in 1903, the novel was published in its full form. In 1902, the novel was published in its full form. Um, this created a lot of sensation for the public who were really hoping that Sherlock had been revived, but they were disappointed to realize that this was just a posthumous story, something that takes place before his death over the Reichenbach Falls. However, Arthur Conan Doyle finally relented in 1903. He brought back Sherlock Holmes to life in The Empty House. Fans rejoiced, it became almost a national celebration. There were queues of people waiting to buy the copy of the story, which appeared as usual in The Strand. Thereafter, he wrote The Valley of Fear and His Last Bow. His final short story was The Adventure of Shoscombe Old Place, published in June 1927. Uh, it was published initially in the Liberty magazine on the 5th of March, and then it was collected into the Case Book of Sherlock Holmes. Having contextualized Sherlock Holmes and his creator and the circumstances of his creation, we now come over to the chief focus of our discussion today, the Hound of the Baskervilles. It's very interesting if we go into the novel by itself. It is a fantastic mystery. It is full of terror. It is full of the pure elements of fear. And it and even today, for a person sitting and reading, whether in Jhargram, whether in India, whether in Australia, I think we all feel the same instincts of fear and terror when we initially go through the story. Now, there are several interesting aspects as to the origins of the story. In 1901, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had struck up a friendship with a journalist whose name was Mr. Bertram Fletcher Robinson. He was his golfing partner. And as it happens, Conan Doyle went on a visit to his home in Devonshire, and they used to take many walks along the moor, Dartmoor as it is called. Robinson had a coachman whose name was Baskerville, and of course, there's no mystery as to how Conan Doyle sourced the name of Baskerville. While they walked along the moors every day during his visit, Robinson would often inform Conan Doyle about the local legends. And when and it was during their walks, during their discussions, that the story of the Hound of the Baskervilles came up. In a footnote, in the footnote of the story, Arthur Conan Doyle had written, "This story owes its inception to my friend Mr. Fletcher Robinson, who has helped me both in the general plot and in the local details." In fact, he even gave a part of the royalties to Robinson. Such was the depth of his influence. One of the other sources of the story is the legend of Richard Cabell. The core of the story goes back to the 17th century, literally like the story of Hugo Baskerville, when Richard Cabell inspired a local legend. He lived at Brook Manor near Buckfastleigh during the middle of the 17th century. His family owned land all over the south of Dartmoor. Uh, Due to a miscommunication, or because they were fighting on the side of the royalists and they lost during the civil war, they were forced to pay a heavy fine by the Puritan authorities. He went on to marry the daughter of one of the Puritan authority, and once he was married, he got his estate back. His fine was forgiven. Obviously, this is why marriages were made in many cases. However, he did not have a good relationship with his wife, and the legend says that he had chased her out onto the moors with his dogs in a jealous rage one night. Though historical records indicate that the wife had actually outlived him, this was the legend that surrounded Richard Cabell. In retaliation, the wife was said to have had a faithful hound who returned and ripped out his throat. On his death, he was buried in an elaborate family tomb at Brook Manor, and there were lots of cages and windows and several layers. It was a very elaborate tombstone, and apparently after his death, villagers would see hounds going in and out of the tomb. Hounds breathing fire were seen passing in and out of the windows of his manor on the night of his death. Many more interesting legends also surround Richard Cabell. For more information, you can always look up the internet. There are countless legends, countless stories. But this is the part which is the most interesting, because it seems to us as though Arthur Conan Doyle absolutely based the character of Hugo Baskerville on Richard Cabell. And obviously, the legend of the Hellhound. There's a local legend in Dartmoor itself where a black hound, the agent of death, can be seen walking over the moors at night, and whoever sees the hound is certain to meet his death. There are other legends of hounds as well, one of which is the legend of the wished hounds. The whist hounds or the wish hounds are ghostly versions of normal hounds who accompany a huntsman in pursuit of his prey through the night. Also, again, a local legend of Dartmoor. There's also the legend of the Farvan, which is derived from the book folklore in lowland Scotland. Remember, Arthur Conan Doyle had connections to Scotland through his mother. This is a fairy hound. Fairy, I do not mean it in a good sense. A fairy in the sense of an evil spirit or a spirit which does not mean much good. Uh, this fairy hound is also comparable with Baskervilles hound, where the Farvan moved silently, but for all its gliding gait, the print of its paws, as big as a human hand, were found on mud or sand or snow. This clearly recalls to us the footprints of the gigantic hound which Dr. Mortimer uh, had seen right after the death of Sir Charles Baskerville. Its voice was sonorous and far reaching. Again, it reminds us of the Hound of Baskerville when it's called out from its location in the middle of the Grimpen Moor. Everyone, literally everyone, would be scared, whether it was Watson armed with his pistol, whether it was Sir Henry Baskerville, they would get the chills. It paused between each bark and at a time gave vent to only three roars. Its baying struck terror into the pursued, who was invariably overtaken and destroyed after the third bark, if he had not hidden himself from his unearthly pursuer. So the Farvan almost couldn't be seen, and if you heard his third roar, you were supposed to go and hide yourself. If you didn't hide yourself, it would pursue you and kill you. Though the Hound of the Baskerville does not have this legend, I mean, there are no number of barks after which it would come and kill you. But its bark, its baying was enough to terrorize anyone who heard it, as is evidenced by the death of Selden, as is evidenced by the reaction of Sherlock and Watson right before the death of Selden. So these were the legends of the hellhounds, from which the Hound of the Baskervilles is clearly inspired, the legend of the Hound. So here are pictures which can be seen only if I make it a full screen, but I will not do that lest it hang the presentation. Um, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was said to have visited Hayford Hall, which is located even today in Dartmoor, and Cromer Hall. I have a picture of Hayford Hall right here. And today, Hayford Hall has a statue of the Hound of the Baskerville as a tribute to the novel, which has made this house very, very famous. And Dartmoor itself is a real location. Unfortunately, I cannot show you full pictures, but here you can see the craggy tors. The tors are granite hilltops, and this landscape dates from the Carboniferous period, which was literally many, many millions of years ago. So, a landscape as ancient as that, and the granite tors jut out from the landscape and create a very, very difficult and jagged landscape, as is repeatedly described in The Hound of the Baskervilles. Here you have a black and white picture of the same. It's a foggy atmosphere. You can see a tor jutting out of the landscape. And if a thick fog comes into this landscape, it would be very, very difficult for anyone to move through this place. No wonder that the legend reminded the Baskervilles never to venture out into the moor at night when the powers of evil are exalted. I found a helpful map of the novel during my research where you can see everything as it happened. So, this is Baskerville Hall, located in one part of the moor. This is Yew Alley, the summer house near which the body of Sir Charles was found. Remember, Sir Charles waited at the gate. This part is the moor. And he was waiting at the gate for Mrs. Laura Leones, who never showed up. Instead, what showed up This is the old tin mine. This is Merry Pit House. This is the Grimpen Mire. The hound was kept in this old tin mine, and Stapleton used to bring it by road and keep it in an outhouse of the Merry Pit House. So from Merry Pit House, he would release the hound, and obviously it had no difficulty scaling through the landscape at night, and it jumped over the gate and made Sir Charles run for his life until he collapsed and died of heart failure. These were the Bronze Age stone huts where Sherlock Holmes was hiding. Here are the various stores, one of where Sherlock Holmes was standing against the moonlight. The body of Selden was found somewhere in the middle of the moor, again chased to his death by the hound. Laughter Hall, where Frankland continually scanned the moor with his telescope. This was the Grimpen hamlet. Many other smaller homes and shelters were here. Dr. Mortimer lived somewhere here. Across the hill, though we do not have the hill, was Coombe Tracy and the house of Mrs. Laura Lyons. Moving on, we come to the key ideas of the novel. I will take a little bit more of your time. I know that we are hitting an hour already, and listening to online lectures is quite a task for anyone who's on the other side and only listening. So, things that are important about the text. Firstly, its location and atmosphere. Doyle deliberately set the Hound of the Baskervilles in Dartmoor in the late 19th century. It takes away both Sherlock Holmes and Watson away from the familiarity of their London landscape, their city life, and situates them in a place with which they are not familiar. On his first encounter with the moor, Watson feels very depressed. Watson feels very dejected, and he sustains that impression throughout his stay at Dartmoor. Baskerville Hall. Today, there's a hotel called Baskerville Hall in Dartmoor, and they capitalize on the fame of Dartmoor as made famous by this novel. And there are many, many artifacts and objects in the hotel which are inspired. There's even a sculpture of a dog, the hound, which is right outside the gate. So Baskerville Hall lies at the center of this story. If we go back to this slide, Baskerville Hall is the largest mansion, it's the largest castle-like structure in all of Grimpen Moor. It is the place of the Baskervilles, the richest family who inhabit the place. And the atmosphere of Baskerville Hall is anything but comfortable. It is like a fortress. It carries with it the history of the entire family, right from the days of Hugo Baskerville or even before. It carries within it a certain atmosphere. I remember reading about a similar house containing an atmosphere within itself in The Fall of the House of Usher. Uh, I think the students have not read it, but I'm sure my, the professors of the college must have read it. The Fall of the House of Usher is one such story where the house itself creates most of the atmosphere of the novel. The house acts in a dual manner in this story, in The Hound of the Baskervilles. It acts as a kind of protection for the Baskervilles. It also acts as the location of the first incident of evil. Remember, the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles begins with the entrapment of the maiden inside Baskerville Hall. So, the Baskerville Hall contains within it a history of evil, and unfortunately, the Baskervilles are cursed. if they step outside the hall. So the hall itself is of a dual nature. The moor in itself is a location for the story. It creates the atmosphere of mystery and terror. Another name for a moor would be a heath, made famous by Thomas Hardy in The Return of the Native, his location of the story on Egdon Heath, where nothing but tragedy occurs. So, the heath, a barren landscape where nothing much grows except for shrubs or heather. The barrenness of the landscape has mostly inspired authors to place stories of mystery, terror, and tragedy. Dartmoor, however, is a very, very beautiful moor, but because of its ancient history, because of the craggy landscape and the tors and the marshland, it provided the perfect landscape for this situation of mystery and terror. Watson, from the time of entering the moor, he finds the setting oppressive. In chapter 6 or chapter 7, I think, he says that the rattle of our wheels died away as we drove through drifts of rotting vegetation. Sad gifts, as it seemed to me, for nature to throw before the carriage of the returning air of the Baskervilles. So instead of spring blooming to welcome the air of the Baskervilles, it is almost a landscape of rotting vegetation and a scene of despair. The wildness of the moors is an important element in creating the forbidding and foreboding setting. And in locating his stories, we must not also forget the contributions of Sidney Paget. Sidney Paget was hired by mistake by the publication house, The Strand. Initially, they were supposed to hire his brother Walter Paget, and they ended up writing to Sidney Paget, who accepted the contract. And today, his illustrations have become an inextricable part of the Sherlock Holmes canon. So, whatever illustrations you see in my presentation today, as much as you can see them, they are all by Sidney Paget. A typical question: The Hound of the Baskervilles as a Gothic novel. I am sure most of us know what is a Gothic novel. The term Gothic came into vogue in the 18th century with the Castle of Otranto, with the novels of Mrs. Radcliffe, uh, Beckford's Vathek, William Godwin's Caleb, and many others. Gothic became a very fashionable form of writing. It became one of the precursors of romantic literature, and it contained very typical, very stereotypical plot points which were found repeatedly in the narratives. Many of these plot points find their echo in The Hound of the Baskervilles. For instance, there is a large house, an old castle mansion or a manor house, and we have the Baskerville Hall, an atmosphere of mystery and suspense, which is constantly there from the time of the narration of the legend. The moment that we read the legend as narrated by Dr. Mortimer in the initial chapters, we feel a sense of thrill and foreboding, which doesn't go away until the very climactic end when the hound finally appears, chapter 14. There's an ancient prophecy which is supported by the legend of the Baskervilles, the legend of the Hound. Characters in Gothic novels frequently go through certain visions. They they suffer. They are subject to omens. They there's a portent of tragedy constantly happening. This is there again in the legend, and Sir Henry's almost paranoid fears of being attacked and put to death by the Hound. The element of the supernatural, repeatedly, we are told about the Hound, which is an agent of evil, the agent of the devil, something that Sherlock Holmes constantly denies. A lot of emotion is there in Gothic novels. In this novel, however, emotion is placed in a limited manner in the character of Mrs. Barrymore, who cries over her brother Selden. The situation of the damsel in distress. Gothic novels often feature young and beautiful maidens who fall into distress or who are victimized by a tyrannical male figure. In this case, we have the character of Beryl Stapleton and also Laura Lyons, who are manipulated and abused by Stapleton, who becomes the ultimate villain. Another Another important aspect of this novel is the constant conflict between science and superstition. If we were to analyze the novel and to ask ourselves, what is this novel about? What is the central message of the novel? The answer undoubtedly would be to dispel all superstitions and to assure the reader that above all other understandings of our world, nothing could be superior to a rational, logical, and scientific understanding of it. This is the message that Arthur Conan Doyle wants to convey to his readers through the character of Sherlock Holmes repeatedly and especially in this novel. It's a little ironic that this novel is making an appeal for science and reason, because this was the same time when Arthur Conan Doyle was gradually drifting into the world of superstitions, the world of spiritualism, and he was also defrauded by two girls who had dressed up as fairies, and this caused him a lot of, this gave him a bad name because he could not spot the obvious fraud. So when we go into The Hound of the Baskervilles as a manifesto recommending science and logic and reason above all else, it automatically contradicts the Gothic atmosphere where everything, all elements of mystery and terror, are ultimately explained away by science, evidence, and logic. When Dr. Mortimer reads out his stories, Holmes is not at all impressed. He exclaims, "And you, a trained man of science, believe this legend to be supernatural, believe this hound to be supernatural?" Dr. Mortimer, as well as Dr. Watson, even though Watson does not quite believe, both Dr. Mortimer and Watson are sort of cannot escape the atmosphere of the legend. Both are affected by the atmosphere of the superstition. Except for Sherlock, everyone else seems to be affected. And when Holmes is removed from his studio in Baker Street and settles into Dartmoor, he too finds the atmosphere affecting. And yet, he stays he stays in one of the Bronze Age stone huts, living a very, very Spartan life, committed to finding the truth. And ultimately, he is able to logically explain all the facts. Um, the novel also is very interesting from the point of view of a student, because even if you don't read through the novel, everything is explained to us in chapter 15, the final chapter. So if you want to go through a shortcut and read a summary of the novel, just read your chapter 15 and you will know almost everything that happens in the novel. Sherlock repeatedly denies that there is an evil influence, and he is consistently committed to finding all the facts which would reveal the criminal and his intention of evil. The criminal, Stapleton, is likewise proved to have a reason for his evil intentions. He is also a Baskerville, and he feels legally entitled to the Baskerville fortune. Thus, every aspect of the novel is logically rounded into a complete story. If we are looking at the structural aspect of the novel follows a very basic structure of removing the reader and the characters from the comfort and the regular life of a city and takes us back into a very, very primitive world. The intention of the novel is to awaken within us those primal instincts of fear, those primal instincts of a sense of mystery, a sense of wonder, and then to prove to us that everything can be explained by reason and logic. This structure is literally patterned or reflected in the pattern of Sir Henry's physical journey from Canada to Dartmoor, literally moving from a place of civilization to a very primitive world. He sails from the new world of Canada to the old world of England. Then he takes the train. From the train, he switches to a wagonette, kind of going backward, from using steam power, he moves into horsepower. Then he steps down from the carriage, he starts walking. And finally, he walks into Baskerville Hall and he walks among the prehistoric huts. All of this taking him ages back in time. These elements are deliberately put by Doyle as a kind of a distancing process to make the supernatural seem real to a very sophisticated city audience. The idea of Doyle is to remove both his readers and his detective from their comfort zone and to throw them into a world where instincts based on primal and primitive nature would take over your reasoning capacities. And obviously, there is no wonder that he chose Sherlock to be the chief detective of the story, because it is only Sherlock who can overcome all his fears, all his instincts, and definitely settle upon his powers of reason. As Watson puts it in one of the chapters, once you enter the moor, you have left all traces of modern England behind you, but on the other hand, you're conscious everywhere of the homes and the work of the prehistoric people. So, this is a picture of Stapleton showing Watson and Sir Henry Baskerville around the moor. These are the tours, and as you can see, this is an original illustration by Sidney Paget for the Strand magazine. He keeps his initials in the bottom right corner. Coming to the characters, apart from Sherlock, there are many other important characters in this novel. Dr. John Watson, obviously the next most important character after Sherlock. His importance in this novel is of a different kind, because in all the other novels, he acts as a kind of constant companion and an assistant to Sherlock. In this novel, he gets a chance to act as a detective himself. He is the narrator of the story as well as a character. He is taking part in some of the key actions of the novel. He is setting up a parallel investigation to that of Sherlock. We all know that he meets Sherlock towards the middle of the novel when Sherlock shows up on the moor quite by surprise. By then, Watson has settled up a parallel investigation, and interestingly, their investigations meet at very many common points. Holmes lavishes some very rare praise on Watson in the very first chapter. I am bound to say that in all the accounts which you have been so good as to give of my own small achievements, you have habitually underrated your own abilities. It may be that you are not yourself luminous, but you are a conductor of light. Some people, without possessing genius, have a remarkable power of stimulating it. I confess, my dear fellow, that I am very much in your debt. In these lines, we get to understand the role of Watson not only in this particular book, but in all the other adventures that Sherlock has had with Watson. Watson has acted as a conductor of genius. He has been a medium through which Sherlock's genius has continually shined. So you can say that without Watson, Sherlock would not have been the character that he is. His investigations in this novel prove to be very valuable as Sherlock repeatedly iterates, and his strategy of narration is multifold. Not only does he write from memory, but he also uses pages from his diary and letters and reports that he has sent to Holmes. And we are able to trust his narrative because his methods and his constant reevaluation of his methods prove his authenticity as a narrator. Finally, as a trusty friend, as a valuable ally to Holmes, never once does he question the methods of Holmes, nor does he try to impose his own ideas or methods. He never contradicts Holmes. This is kind of like a dream relationship where your friend never questions you. This is the amount of trust that they place in each other. And even though he's stung by the betrayal that Holmes did not share his plans with him even once, ultimately he realizes that Holmes acted in the best interests of everyone, especially of Sir Henry Baskerville. So Watson is a very, very important character in this novel. This is an illustration by Sidney Paget for the Strand magazine of Sir Henry Baskerville. Sir Henry Baskerville is the most clueless character in this entire novel. He is freshly returned from Canada. He proves that he has a good heart. He is interested in continuing the philanthropic jobs that his uncle had set out to do. And no matter what he does, he is never in complete knowledge of the events. Neither Holmes nor Watson share with him the full details of his history at first. Neither Holmes nor Dr. Mortimer. Later on, when he falls in love with Miss Stapleton, he is not aware that she is the wife of Stapleton himself. He is used and manipulated by the Stapleton. And later on, because of the cunning of Stapleton, poor Baskerville literally has to be the bait that Sherlock uses to prove his case against Stapleton. A few seconds of delay, and he would have definitely been seriously injured by the Hound of the Baskervilles. But because of the goodness of his heart and because of his interest, his deep love for Dartmoor and his interest in improving the countryside with his finances, he proves himself to be a worthy heir to the Baskerville fortune. Characterization of the women. As a woman myself, I find this characterization a little odd and a little stereotypical. As I was explaining to my class the other day, when you read these characters critically, you realize that these characters were written by a man, unfortunately, because they follow a very similar structural pattern. Both of them fall in love with the same man, and both of them are devoted to this man who manipulate them in the name of love. And it is, and both of them are willing to uh, do anything for him until they discover that he has been unfaithful. And it is then that they have a very quick and inexplicable turnaround where they suddenly betray his safety and they reveal everything that they made him do. So it is almost like stating that women live for love. Women are willing to tolerate any kind of abuse, as is proved by Beryl Stapleton, who is repeatedly hit by Stapleton, abused by Stapleton, and yet she keeps hoping for his love. It is only when the women discover that he has been disloyal in love, that is when they have this quick turnaround, and it is so awkward because um, no woman deserves to undergo such abuse. Be that as it may, this is the circumstance of the novel, and both of them prove to be very important in the plot of the novel. Mrs. Laura Leons is manipulated by Stapleton to lure Sir Charles Baskerville out of his house at night. Nothing in the world could make him step out of his house because he was so afraid of the legend. And yet, he wanted to be kind to Mrs. Leons, and because of his affection for her, he stepped out only to face his death. Beryl Stapleton confesses everything about her husband once she realizes his disloyalty, and she leads Sherlock and Watson to the center of the moor, to the old tin mine where they kept the dog. The character of Jack Stapleton, I know I have taken up a lot of time, so I'm just going to run through Stapleton's character. Stapleton's character, though he is not as important as Professor Moriarty, on more than one occasion we see Sherlock Holmes praising his genius and his cunning because of the methodology that he employs in his crimes. His modus operandi can be read through in chapter 15, a retrospection. It is clear that he had realized that he was a Baskerville and that he had fortunes in England. His father had relocated to South America. He was born there. He married a South American woman. He came to England with the precise intention of claiming his fortunes. And in various incidents, his methodology is praised. In the initial chapters, when there's that frenetic cab chase where Sherlock Holmes is chasing the bearded man, and the bearded man leaves off his identity as Sherlock Holmes. Holmes himself realizes that he has a very worthy adversary, an intelligent man, a cunning man. The second time Holmes praises him is when he realizes how Stapleton had transformed Sir Charles's paranoia into a real threat by literally bringing in an actual hound and making the hound chase Sir Charles to death. As Holmes realizes, nothing could prove Stapleton's involvement in this case. There were no death marks, there were no obvious signs of crime, and Holmes is bound to praise his genius. The third time, Holmes is impressed when he finds the paste of phosphorus with which Stapleton had painted the mouth of the hound to make it appear as though he was a literal hellhound, as though it was a literal hellhound flaming at the mouth. And thus he proves himself to be a criminal mastermind, an agent of pure evil, simply because of the genius with which he planned his crime. One more character whom we see is Inspector Lestrade. He has always had a very, a hot and cold relationship with Sherlock Holmes, but he earns a word of praise in The Hound of the Baskervilles, where Sherlock calls him the best that can be found at Scotland Yard. They have a long history. I think, Inspector Lestrade and one more inspector, I forget, Gregson. Both of them have appeared repeatedly throughout the novels and the short stories. And earlier in the novels and the short stories, Sherlock would be shown to be getting the better of them. Sherlock would be shown to be solving the crimes first, which inspired their jealousy. But later on, Lestrade admits that we are not jealous of you at Scotland Yard. No, sir, we are very proud of you. So, Inspector Lestrade is a character who is a recurrent character found in other novels of Arthur Conan Doyle. So, my final slide would be uh, a kind of a recall of all the points that we have gone together. It is important for all of us that we still read and love this novel a lot because of the atmosphere of suspense, the atmosphere of terror, the location in a primitive landscape, the murder, the ghostly legend, the mysterious happenings, all of the gothic elements of the novel, the constant threat of evil, as also proved by the presence of Selden, the serial killer. And finally, Sherlock Holmes, the great detective who would solve the mystery, the murder, and bring us all out of this atmosphere of mystery and terror. And so I end my lecture with the hope that I have been able to throw some light on the legend that is Sherlock Holmes. And I hope this lecture will be of some use to the students who are to appear very soon for their examination. Thank you for listening and thank you for attending.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a wonderful lecture. You have touched on all the aspects of this text. I must say that The Hound of the Baskervilles is a very challenging text for any teacher to teach, because though it is a part of popular literature and also detective genre, but we have found that it is very challenging as a for us, for teachers, to actually initiate the students into the popular mood. Even when I teach Abul Tabul or text like Through the Looking Glass, the same problem actually happens to the teacher as well. But you have summed it up brilliantly. Actually, it is a wonderful blending of entertainment as well as the kind of insightful content that your lecture actually had. I think students have been immensely benefited from this lecture, and now I would request the participants, if they have any question, they can ask, they can unmute themselves. Students, you are encouraged to ask questions to the ma'am, and you can also type it out in the chat box. Okay, 6th sem students especially, or those who are from 4th semester or 2nd sem, you can also ask.
I would like to add to Professor Doipayan Mitro's statement that, as when we are teachers, as teachers teaching popular literature, firstly, it kills the fun of popular literature, because popular literature, crime fiction is meant to be enjoyed. Abul Tawul is meant to be enjoyed, it is meant to be heard. And once you start going into all the factual details, it literally takes away from the fun of actually experiencing the novel. But if you read around it, if you read all the context and all the the backstories, and if you read all the everything that comes with it, it makes for a very, very enjoyable academic experience. So I hope students will learn to appreciate popular literature as an academic discipline later on. Now, if you have any questions, especially students, I'll be happy to answer.
Okay, we have one question that is put in the chat box. Sanchari from 6M has asked the question, can we call this detective fiction is a psychological story?
Yes, Shanchari, you have placed forward a very, very important aspect of the novel which I have not covered in my lecture. Of course, it is a psychological story. It is a psychological story because look at the circumstances in which Sir Charles Baskerville dies. Sir Charles Baskerville, if you have read the novel very carefully, you will remember the part where Dr. Mortimer tells us that Sir Charles Baskerville adopted the legend as he placed it in his heart. He began to seriously believe that um, he would be a victim of the legend. He would be the next Baskerville to die. And it is almost as if he made this prediction into a reality. And later on, when we read the legend, when Sir Henry reads the legend, remember he's a foreigner come from Canada. And if you have read Victorian British fiction, you would know that Canadians and Americans are greatly mistrusted. They are seen as foreigners, they are seen as an inferior species who have no knowledge of culture. So, Sir Henry Baskerville is already feeling very awkward as he lands in England. And the moment he comes into contact with Sherlock Holmes and he uh, hears all the stories, suddenly he is faced with this prospect as though it was like a death sentence, that if you go into Baskerville Hall, if you go into Dartmoor, your death is confirmed. You are likely to die. As if this was not enough, remember, he has just walked into England. He had left England probably as a 12 or a 14-year-old boy, and then he comes back and he's staying in a hotel. His new boot goes missing. When his new boot is found, his old boot goes missing. When his old, and in the midst of that, he receives a threat letter cut out from a newspaper and stuck together, which tells him to go back, to not go to the moor, because his death is his death would be his destiny, as it were. All this obviously plays a huge all this has a huge impact on his psychology. All this has a huge impact on the psychology of any Baskerville who has lived in the hall for generations. If you remember how the legend ended, it is a father advising his sons never to step out into the moor at night when the powers of evil are exalted. We talk about the powers of evil being exalted as though it is an hour of the devil, as though the devil is at play on the moors. So, all these factors come together to present, to impact the psychology of the readers as well as the characters very, very deeply. The only person who is not affected by all these psychological hankerings, as it were, is Sherlock Holmes himself. And it is up to him to prove the reality of all this psychological fear mongering. How does he do that? He understands the modus operandi of Stapleton. He goes into the basic facts. If you remember the relationship between Sir Charles Baskerville and Stapleton, Stapleton had wiled his way into the heart of Sir Charles Baskerville, and Sir Charles Baskerville is an old man. I am sure we have all seen our parents and grandparents uh, in their advanced stages, they become very trusting of others. They start narrating their innermost secrets. Even today, if you look at the incidents of old people being murdered in their own houses across Bengal, especially in Calcutta, there are common factors. They are murdered by their servants. The servants were very close to them, and it is clear that they had apparently shared the deepest secrets of their heart. So Charles Baskerville made Stapleton a manager of his trustee. He placed his faith on Stapleton. He he told Stapleton about his innermost fears, and Stapleton, like any good criminal, made the maximum use of his fears. So, obviously, this is a psychological story where Stapleton uses psychological tools to literally frighten an old man to death. But it is not just a psychological story, it is a psychological story where everything that we are afraid of, all our fears, are disproved by science, reason, and logic. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
If there is any other student, participants can ask. In the meantime, when questions are coming, we can. I have one doubt that whether we can call Sherlock Holmes as a kind of Ubermensch, because whether that philosophy we can apply to the persona of the detective fiction, the way he has been treated. Uh, so that is my question to ma'am.
I think the Ubermensch was a particular theory developed by the Victorians in that age because they were looking at, they were finally starting to believe in evolution. I'm sure you know about that whole period of faith and doubt when half the population, most of the population couldn't, accept that we had evolved from primates, we had evolved from monkeys, literally. And they were content to believe in the fact that we were God's special creation. God has created man in his best image, and so on and so forth. So, in that sense, when they started to finally believe in evolution, and they realized that we have evolved from primates over millions of years. See, they started believing that we would be developing into better and more better versions of ourselves. I think that was the core belief of the Ubermensch. And as a detective, Sherlock Holmes obviously takes in the best of the traits of his predecessors. As I said, Leacock and Dupin and Sergeant Cuff. But I think just so that he would not be mistaken as a god figure or as a kind of a perfect figure, I think Doyle deliberately places within him certain defects, such as his drug addiction. He was given to drug addiction. He was addicted to morphine and cocaine, and he was given to bouts of melancholy, today, which we loosely call depression. And he had these phases where he would literally cut everyone off. He wouldn't be talking to Watson. He um, he sort of plays the violin by himself. He has his moments of social isolation. He strongly uh, rejects any kind of company. He doesn't have any school friends. He doesn't have any friends from college. I think only one friend from college makes his appearance in the entire canon. So Sherlock Holmes is not perfect. And as a detective, he's highly honed in his skills. But even he meets his adversary in Professor Moriarty, and he's not able to completely defeat Moriarty, resulting in his own faked death, which later proves to be a faked death. But at the moment of the final problem, we are given to believe that if he wasn't, even though he wasn't defeated, he meets his own end in trying to defeat Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime.
Thank you, ma'am. One question has come, that is whether we can call the Hound of the Baskervilles a comedy.
A comedy. If you take it in the Shakespearean sense of all's well that ends well, it's a comedy in that sense. But if you're looking at other features of the comedy, like where are the couples? Where are the features of love and romance? Poor Henry Baskerville fell deeply in love with Miss Stapleton, and look how that turned out. Uh, the novel is successful in saving the life of Sir Henry Baskerville and proving to us that the legend did not exist. The legend was a concoction, a fiction of someone's imagination. The fact that there was no hellhound. So I would not personally call it a comedy. I would call it uh, a treatise in rationalism.
Thank you, ma'am. And one observation I have, that what is Sherlock Holmes' element of detection or the process of detection? Because earlier the predecessors like Dupin, we have seen that Poe has set great store by the process of ratiocination that is at work in a text like the Purloined Letter. where Dupin actually traces down the culprit or actually retrieves the stolen letter by reliance on that kind of element of ratiocination. I just want to know that whether Doyle follows the same method of ratiocination, because what type of methodology does actually Sherlock Holmes adapt, because we have seen other detectives like Poirot in the murder of Roger Ackroyd, and we have seen also Dupin, a kind of detective who is trying to retrieve the letter following certain modus operandi. In what ways is Sherlock Holmes different from these two detectives in terms of his element of detection or process of detection?
There isn't much of a difference between Holmes and Poirot if you can go into the lines of observation and deduction. In fact, Sherlock Holmes is the pioneer where observation and deduction are concerned. Dupin, of course, as you say, uses the method of resuscitation. And in the case of Dupin, most of the cases are closed room cases where Dupin is literally sitting and solving his case, especially in the Purloined Letter. But in the case of Holmes, as I said in one of the slides, which I had to run through because of the lack of time, uh, Holmes is basically more interested in the crime scene. And Holmes is the pioneer detective in such a case where he he focuses on the crime scene. Poirot also does the same. Poirot, if you have read Poirot well, you will know that he is a derivative of Sherlock Holmes. But Poirot is not a man of action. Poirot is actually someone who is content with deducing. In certain situations, especially at the end of the Hound of the Baskervilles, when remember Sherlock Holmes is quite old at the time, when the Hound leaps into the scene, Sherlock Holmes is the one who reacts instantly. He runs after the hounds. He possesses great athletic skill. He possesses a great sense of reaction, and these are the basic elements which separate him, or sort of kind of uh, differentiate him from the others. Poirot is content with deductions. Sherlock Holmes is also a man of action. Sherlock Holmes comes before Poirot, so Poirot would be derived from.
Thank you, ma'am. One question has come. I think ma'am has already touched on this issue. That is whether we can call it a piece of Gothic literature.
It is a piece of, to summarize it, it is there in one of the slides, and it is Gothic literature which is disproved by logic and reason. So all the Gothic elements are there, which the character of Sherlock Holmes, the detective called Sherlock Holmes, he ultimately disproves it. He kind of proves it to be very commonplace things. There is a man who wanted his fortune, and so he was contemplating murder. Everything that he did, all the fears, all the elements are just his plans to obtain what he was after.
Thank you, ma'am.
Literature, which is elements of Gothic literature with science and reason.
Any other question from the participants or observation? স্টুডেন্টদের যদি বাংলায় পরে প্রশ্ন জিজ্ঞেস করতে চাও ম্যামকে, তাহলে তোমরা করতে পারো, 6M থেকে যারা রয়েছে। যেটা তোমরা আমাকে জিজ্ঞেস
অবশ্যই
করছিলে যে কিছুদিন আগে যে এক্সামের জন্য কোন টপিকসগুলো পড়বে, সেরকম যদি কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে সেগুলো তোমরা জিজ্ঞাসা করতে পারো।
এক্সামের কথা আমি এখন থেকেই বলে দিই। লাস্ট ইয়ার অনলাইন এক্সাম হয়েছিল, এবছরও অনলাইন এক্সাম। সো লাস্ট ইয়ার উই অলরেডি হ্যাড দ্য ক্যারেক্টার অফ স্টেপলটন, আই থিঙ্ক গথিক এলিমেন্টস অ্যান্ড সায়েন্স ভার্সেস সুপারস্টিশন, সব থেকে ইম্পর্টেন্ট টপিকগুলো এসে গেছে। এবারে তাহলে আমরা ওয়াটসনের রোল অ্যাজ ক্যারেক্টার অ্যান্ড নারেটর, one of them can be repeated in a different kind of way. The atmosphere of the novel, location and setting, তারা কি রোল প্লে করে, um, the women characters, it won't sum up to a long answer, but both the women characters taken together can be material for a long answer. The role of women, or the character of women. These would be the areas which I would recommend for the examination.
Thank you, ma'am. And
Thank
now I would request our YC sir, Professor Bishesha Chakraborty, who will wrap it up our today's event and also inform you about our upcoming event that is on Wednesday on Through the Looking Glass. Sir, over to you.
So, thank you, Dave, for such a wonderful and the comprehensive account of the it has been a thoroughly enjoyable one because you have touched almost all the contexts that are associated with it. I hope I am audible. Am I?
Yes, yes, yes.
I hope I am audible.
Yes, sir,
Okay,
yes.
okay. So this has been pleasant. This has been our pleasure listening to you, and it was very lucid. It was very understandable for the students, and I am very happy that some interactions also took place. So it has been a very very wonderful kind of talk, exchange of ideas and everything. And more importantly, that there are questions which also which are, I think, a little bit of critical in their nature. So it is very very it would be very beneficial for the students because you have provided in your lecture a lot of material. You have filled it with a lot of artifacts, pictures, which will arouse the curiosity among the students to read it, not only to read that particular novel, but also other Sherlock Holmes novels and stories. And ultimately, they would be looking at popular literature as something of a serious thing. Actually, popular literatures, though we kill the pop, the fun element of popular literature when we are teaching it, but when it is coming into the canon, then we have to kill it for our academic purposes. So with these few words, I would like to thank you very much from the entire department as well as the college, and we hope that in recent future you would come to the college so that we have more interactions amongst us because we are so neighboring colleges, and it would be very nice if you come. Okay, so sooner or later we will try to arrange for that. I don't know whenever it will be possible. And by the time this is apart from your lecture and other thing. If you have OV6 number, please text me or WhatsApp me. Okay,
of
okay,
course, I will do that. Thank you for your warm words.
okay.
I would definitely look forward to paying a visit to
Okay,
your
Daisy.
college. Thank you so much for having me.
Definitely, definitely, definitely,
Thank
definitely,
you.
definitely. Thank you, Daisy. Okay, hope we shall. Thus, we wrap it up the lecture, and for the information that Doipan sir had said, we may not have a lecture this week because Otonu Bera from Shilda College was supposed to speak of Gulliver's Travels. We'll speak on Gulliver's Travels, obviously, but because of his problem, because he's going under treatment because of his toothache, so he will not be able to do that. I will try to. I have talked with one Dr. Pritha Kundu. Dr. Pritha Kundu uh, from Surendranath College to teach about to talk about Mrityokotik. I don't know whether I will be able to make a date in this week. Uh, I don't know. If we do not post something, you think that for this week we will not be able to arrange anymore. But on 6th, Tariq Ali from Mohanpur Government College will speak on the shadow lines. And on 10th, Otonu Bera from Shilda College will speak on Gulliver's Travels. So these two are sure for us. And if it is possible for us to contact and Dr. Pritha Kundu, and if she could find time, she will be speaking about ritual. Okay, so this is the information for the students. So with these few informations, I would like to